We often hear about BRICS in the news and wonder why new countries are eager to join and, more importantly, what each of them hopes to gain from it. Imagine this: 3.5 billion people, over a quarter of the world's landmass, and around the same portion of the global economy. Uh, that's BRICS. Impressive, right? But here's the issue: these are just numbers. BRICS is not a single country like China with its own laws, culture, territory, government, and people with the same passports. It's not a military alliance like NATO with a shared budget, command center, strategic goals, and common threats. And it's not a political or economic union like the European Union with elected authorities, a parliament, courts, open borders, and nearly a single currency. So, what is BRICS? Why are world leaders talking about it more often? Why are new countries joining? And most interestingly, what does each of them hope to gain from being part of BRICS? Here's the map: 9 countries that are now official BRICS members. But if we rewind a couple of decades, it all started with 4 rapidly growing economies: Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which formed BRIC. Later, South Africa joined, turning BRIC into BRICS. So what do these countries, so different and far from each other, have in common? In short, they possess significant human and natural resources. When combined with the money and technologies from developed Western countries, both sides can profit greatly from shared growth. Interestingly, it wasn't the BRICS countries themselves that first introduced this idea, but the American investment bank Goldman Sachs. In 2001, their economist Jim O'Neill published an article suggesting that Brazil, Russia, India, and China were developing faster than the rest of the world and would become more influential in the global economy. This meant that global financial decisions shouldn't be made only by developed countries, but also by the BRICS nations. Now, an important question: why do these countries still depend so heavily on the US dollar, the national currency of just one country? Even though the US only accounts for 9% of global trade, the dollar still dominates. A staggering 88% of all global currency transactions are conducted in US dollars, and most international deals are tied to it. Take, for example, Saudi Arabia, whose main trading partner today is no longer the US, but China. Why then is the dollar still so powerful? Into English. Arabs buy a huge amount of electronics and other goods from China, worth tens of billions of dollars, and in return, they sell oil and other natural resources for tens of billions as well. So the question arises: why is American currency used in trade between Arabs and Chinese, Brazilians, Europeans, Russians, and other countries? How did the world end up in this situation? To understand this, we need to take a step back. You've probably heard the term gold standard, which refers to a time when the currencies of different countries were tied to the value of the world's main precious metal, gold. But why gold? First of all, it's beautiful. More importantly, it's soft and easy to work with, making it ideal for minting coins. It doesn't rust or react to environmental conditions like iron does, and it doesn't dissolve in water. Moreover, gold is relatively rare and hard to obtain for ordinary people, unlike shells, for example, making it easier for governments to control. Historically, gold became the foundation for currencies. The names of currencies like the pound, franc, or dollar are essentially units of weight. For instance, a pound sterling was 1/4 of a gold ounce, while a dollar was roughly 1/20th of an ounce. Paper money emerged so people wouldn't have to carry metal with them. Gold was stored in bank vaults, and the government issued certificates, those very pounds and dollars that represented how much gold you had. In the 19th century, the gold standard became the basis for the global economy. It simplified trade between countries and allowed investments anywhere in the world, since such money was backed by real gold, and at any moment you could exchange banknotes for metal. But everything changed with the outbreak of World War I. Countries involved in the war began printing money uncontrollably to finance their military expenses. As a result, they effectively declared bankruptcy to their citizens by abandoning the gold standard. The only exception was the United States, which entered the war later and hadn't printed enough dollars to make it impossible to back them with gold. While British pounds, French francs, and German marks sharply devalued, the dollar remained stable. This situation allowed the dollar to surge ahead, though it wasn't yet a dominant force. That all changed after World War II, when many European countries moved their gold reserves to the US, specifically to the famous Fort Knox in Kentucky, to protect them from being seized. This was a key moment in strengthening the dollar's position. The final stroke came with the signing of the Bretton Woods Agreements in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Resort in the US. Representatives from 44 countries effectively recognized the dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. These agreements led to the creation of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development to maintain economic stability and support post-war recovery. The first loans were given to European countries like France and the Netherlands to rebuild their infrastructure. For example, American dollars were used to reconstruct one of Europe's largest ports in Marseille, and in the Netherlands, loans were used to purchase new ships. To trade with each other, they're not going to swap boots for tables or canned goods for oil. But where is 70% of the world's gold stored? That's right, in the vaults of the United States. So, as the saying goes, he who pays the piper calls the tune. In this case, the currency. Naturally, not everyone is happy with this. Although the USSR signed the Bretton Woods Agreements, it didn't ratify them. A decade later, the leader of socialist Cuba put it vividly but accurately. The United States was the only developed country not destroyed due to its geographic position, holding almost all the world's gold reserves and surplus industrial and agricultural production, imposing disgraceful terms on the global economy through the famous Bretton Woods Agreement, whose consequences are still felt today. By the mid-1970s, the Bretton Woods system came to an end when the U.S. refused to exchange gold for dollars for other governments and instead linked its currency to another critical global resource, oil. Today, global trade is still largely tied to the U.S. dollar. So, what does this have to do with BRICS? All the countries in this informal group have been increasing their economic weight for decades. They are the ones looking to change, if not dismantle, the current dollar-dominated order. Take China, for example. It is the world's largest factory and a scientific and technological giant. Over the past decades, China has rapidly caught up with the U.S. in economic terms. But the global economy isn't a sport. China achieved its success because its main customers are the U.S. and Europe, which together pay over $1 trillion to Chinese companies annually. Is that dependency? Absolutely. It's clear that the European Union, the US, and China can't exist without each other, just as they can't without other countries that supply oil and gas, like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and the UAE. It's important to note that the world is changing quickly. Just a few decades ago, the US and other developed countries dominated global trade, but now China is the biggest seller, and BRICS countries' share of the global economy has grown to 15%. However, there's a problem. Despite BRICS countries' economic growth, they haven't combined their resources into a unified force. Each country is developing separately. BRICS joint projects don't seem particularly grand compared to established organizations like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, or the World Bank. These institutions were created under the Bretton Woods system. The World Bank was originally called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, established to rebuild Europe and Japan after World War II. Today, it funds projects in 152 countries aimed at reducing poverty, improving education, and protecting the environment. The total investment is $346 billion, with much of it going to India, Africa, South America, and Eastern Europe. The IMF provides loans to countries facing financial difficulties, with the largest borrowers being Argentina, Egypt, Ukraine, and Pakistan. Altogether, countries owe the IMF $112 billion. The main drawback of the IMF and the World Bank is that they are controlled by developed countries, especially the US and the G7. These countries hold 41% of the voting power in the IMF. Meanwhile, BRICS has created its own alternative, the New Development Bank, NDB, with its headquarters in Shanghai. The bank invests in infrastructure projects in BRICS countries and lends to other developing nations. However, in almost 10 years, the bank has approved only $22 billion worth of projects, modest amounts compared to other institutions. An interesting point, when the G7 countries imposed sanctions on Russia, the New Development Bank suspended its investments in Russian projects to avoid falling under sanctions. This shows that although BRICS countries are unhappy with dollar dominance, when it comes to making concrete decisions, things remain the same. Moreover, BRICS countries have very different interests. Take Russia and China, for example. In 2017, US President Donald Trump signed a document called the New US National Security Strategy, which stated that China and Russia aim to undermine US prosperity and seek to expand their influence worldwide by directing investments into developing countries. China is investing billions of dollars in infrastructure around the world. Russia projects its economic influence by controlling key energy resources and other infrastructures in Europe and Central Asia. Detailed documents can be found via the link in the description, but the bottom line is, when you're named the primary threat, mentioned 112 times, you have two options. Either try to negotiate, saying, "I'm not a threat," or start living up to that image. As we can see, the second scenario is actively unfolding. For Russia and China, BRICS is a convenient platform to bring together as many countries rejected by the West as possible and, in doing so, stand against it. Iran has already joined, and other countries are also gravitating toward BRICS because they need loans without political conditions and democratic reforms, or discounts on oil, gas, and other resources. For instance, India is taking full advantage of this by receiving Russian oil at favorable terms. However, when it comes to de-dollarization and trade in national currencies, India is not interested in turning BRICS into a strictly anti-Western bloc. India receives massive investments, largely from American companies, and without these investments, it would struggle to feed nearly 1.5 billion people. Despite China's significant economic power, it is unlikely to replace these resources, as China itself has over 1 billion mouths to feed. India's most advantageous position is to balance between the West, the Middle East, China, and other centers of power. Given its geography situated at the crossroads of trade routes and its territorial disputes with China, severing ties with the West and aligning closely with China is unwise. If we compare Russia and China, they fit together like puzzle pieces. Russia has the resources, and China has the workforce and technology. But in the case of India and China, this model doesn't work. They are direct competitors. India prefers to remain in BRICS and maintain its political neutrality, avoiding sharp conflicts. This situation is similar for Brazil, South Africa, and the new members, the UAE, Ethiopia, and Egypt. For them, BRICS is not an ideological alliance, but a means of elevating their international status. For instance, Iran hopes to use this structure to escape international sanctions, while poorer countries like Egypt and Ethiopia are likely looking for loans through the BRICS Bank without the strict democratic obligations required by the IMF. The future of BRICS, where countries join the organization for their own interests rather than shared values, remains uncertain. But as Queen Victoria once said, "England has no eternal friends, only eternal interests." BRICS countries are in a similar position. Their economic role on the global stage is primarily in raw material production, providing cheap labor, and manufacturing simple industrial goods. Global finances, currencies, and credit are still controlled by developed countries led by the US. Even though countries like China and India are catching up with or have already overtaken the West on paper, the populations of these countries remain overwhelmingly poor, despite being the backbone of global production. This is a problem that needs addressing, as the gap between rich and poor countries remains enormous. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. Let me know if this works for your project.